that ain't good. I'm going to show you how to fix that. And we're going to do it right now. If you're watching this video, I figure you're one of two people. The first one saying, that is really simple. I don't even know why I'm watching this video. The second being, yeah, I have a situation just like that and I don't know where to start. So this video is for the second type of person. And if you're the first, feel free to watch anyways. What inspired me to make this video in the first place is a friend actually reached out to me and said, hey, my cat absolutely destroyed my door trim in my apartment and I want to fix it so I can get my security deposit back. Do you have a video on it? And I said, no, I don't, but I should. And that's where we are. I'm going to show you how to fix this, give you a couple different options, and hopefully you can get it done yourself with minimal tools and for a very low price. When I look at this, I can picture 3 different ways to fix this. And by the way, this was my dog not being happy that we didn't invite him to the party for about 10 minutes. This is kind of a common thing with cats, dogs, furniture bumping trim like this, but this is pretty extreme. The first way that you could fix this is you could use something like Bondo for wood and fill all this in. And the only thing about that is if you're not familiar with using it, it might be a little tricky to get these profiles here depending on what type of trim you have. But I do have a video on that I will leave in the description. The second option I can think of for this is to cut the trim about right here and put a piece in here. The only thing about that is getting this seam to look good. Maybe it doesn't matter to you, but that could be a lot of work, just like using Bondo. You have to use something like Bondo, or if you caulk it in, it depends on how good you want it to look. But to make it look absolutely perfect is going to be a lot of work. So the third option is what I'm going to go with and show you in this video, and that is to just take this piece of trim off and replace it with a new piece of trim. First step before you even remove this piece of trim is to make sure that you can get it. Mine just so happens to be like the most common door and window trim you can get. But especially if you're in an older house or an older apartment, you might not be able to get the same exact trim. And as a note, this is painted white, which is really common. You might have a stained wood or a clear coated wood. Just keep that in mind when you're picking the trim out. For me, I got this pre-primed piece of trim. So this is going to work for me. Just make sure you can get the trim before you start taking it apart. Let's start taking this piece of trim off. And the first thing I'm going to do is take a utility knife. You can use a razor blade, whatever you have. And I'm going to cut this caulking. You probably won't have to do this if you have stained wood. But if you have caulking, I'm just going to very carefully cut along this seam right here. This is where the trim connects to the door jamb. And if you don't do this, when you try and remove it here, it can make a mess, it can peel the paint, and it'd just be a lot more work in the end. So it's worth it to just go down with a knife just like this and cut that caulking. Against this baseboard, do the same thing. Very carefully. You don't want to cut into the baseboard, just want to cut the caulking. And then along the wall. You should be able to replace this with the same size trim, so you don't really have to worry about messing up the wall. If you don't do this against the wall, that's where you really have problems. It could take a whole big piece of drywall paper right off here, or paint. So don't want to make a mess. Make sure you cut this. Right here at the 45, just try and do the same thing. That way, when you pull this off, it won't mess up this piece of trim. Now keep in mind that not everybody's trim is going to be the same. I have this 45, but yours might be a straight cut, which would make it easier actually. So I'm just going to show you how to do it this way, since this is how mine is. And then you can apply those same principles to your trim. To remove this, if you had a bunch of tools, a good option would be to use a taping knife and some kind of pry bar. Put the taping knife like this to protect the wall. Hammer that pry bar in there and start prying it away. But you might not have a lot of tools. So what I did was I got just a piece of plastic from anything, and you might have a flathead screwdriver. So let's see if we can make this work without messing up the wall. See if I can do it just by hitting it in a little bit and then prying this way, because you're not too concerned with the drywall behind the trim. It's really just this drywall. And you can see that is opening up right there. There we go. Once you get it started, it should be a little easier. There we go. Now, just want to be really careful, make sure as I go up here that none of that caulking is stuck and it's not going to rip any of that paint off. Here's a good example right here. Make sure that is cut just like that. You can also work it from this side. Keep in mind not to pry this way as to not damage this trim, even though it doesn't look that great. Some caulking here. Okay. Just go nice and slow. Okay, so now we want to watch out for this 45 as we pull it. It's probably nailed in here, so just pry it out. Pull from the bottom like this, give it a little wiggle, and that seam should open up. And it does look like it's nailed. And if we're careful, we just keep wiggling. Got it. So sometimes you'll have a nail going in this way, but here you have these joint fasteners. So we have to get all of these out. The good news is that 45 separated very nicely. That's exactly what we wanted. And now I gotta take these out and all the nails and staples that were holding this trim in. I'm gonna use a pair of channel locks to remove all this stuff, but you should be able to use any kind of standard pliers that come in like a home repair kit if you have one, or you could borrow them. And you don't want to pry against any finished surface like this. You want to be careful at this 45. I'm going to start here so that's out of my way so I can get these out. And I'm going to use the old piece of trim to make sure I don't damage the wall around it. Go like this. And that'll give me more leverage as well. With these, you want to be super careful because you could start breaking this apart. I'm just going to grab them and little by little pull them out. Like that. As long as you're gentle, you should be fine. You see that I'm putting my pliers past the face of this, so if I do make an indentation, you're not going to be able to see it when you put the other piece there. Pry against this jamb, but it will be past this caulking line. Should be fine. Yeah, that really dents up the wall, so be careful. I'm going to use my taping knife here. You can use whatever you think will work. You could probably use a butter knife even. This is an old taping knife, by the way, so you can definitely ruin it if you do that. Look at that. I guess the piece was a little short. Use my taping knife to get this caulking out of here. And that's the next step, is to get any caulking or anything that you have stopping you, like this, out of the way. Taping knife like this is great, but you could use a flathead screwdriver, and that should do the trick. Same thing here against the wall. Just be super careful. Sometimes there's caulking in between those pieces, so you'll have to maybe take a knife and cut it out of there. Now I'm just going to clean everything up before we put the new piece in. Now we're ready to install our new piece of trim. Well, not yet. We have to cut it. So what we could do is use the old piece of trim as a template, but as you'll see, for whatever reason, however it worked out, mine is short. I think, honestly, what happened is I was that short, and I didn't want to go all the way to the store for 1/8 of an inch, so I held it up like this, and then I caulked in the bottom. But if your piece is the correct length, you can use it as a template. There's lots of options of how you can do this. You can take a tape measure and you can measure from the floor to the top here, 81 5/8 to the long point, or you could go to the short point and cut a 45-degree angle. You might not have any clue what that means, but if you have somebody that you know that does know, you can mark it on here, or you can just tell them the measurement and say, here you go, friend of mine that has a chop saw or a miter saw or a miter box, whatever they might have them cut it for you. If not, and you are able to get your hands on a saw, doesn't have to be a $300 chop saw. You can get one relatively cheap, and I'll show you the one that I picked up. Another option, if you don't even have a tape measure, you could also hold this piece of trim like this and mark it right here, or mark it right here, so that you have that angle. And one thing I'm going to do is just mark it like this. That is the orientation of that angle, so we don't accidentally cut it that way. Just make sure we're installing it correctly. And make sure before you cut the top that as you're marking it up there, this is sitting flat on the floor like this. If not, if there's a gap, you might want to cut the bottom here to make it look good before you cut the top. This is a miter saw, or I like to call it a chop saw, and it's very easy for cutting trim like this. I just changed the degree to 45 degrees, and all I would have to do is make that cut, but you might not have one of these, so I'm going to show you a couple more options of what you can do to make this cut. Here is another option. This is an old school miter box. It does all these different kind of angles. You have 45s, 22.5s, and then you can do a straight cut for a 90-degree angle. But if you can't get that, you can just use a saw. I'll show you how this one works, but these are relatively inexpensive, and it's always good to have a saw around. So whether you get this and the saw or just the saw, you can make it work. I'll just show you quickly how to use one of these. Really simple. All these slots, for instance, this is a 22.5. You would hold this tight right here and then make your cut like this. It also has this right here, which is pretty cool. If you have a wider board, you could make a 45-degree cut just like that. It also has a square cut right here if you wanted to make a nice straight cut. And this right here is the 45. So you would line up your mark right over here or here, however you marked it, and make sure that the saw is straight up and down, and then you could cut your trim. Definitely a little more tricky to use than just a chop saw, but it gets the job done. Now let's say you don't even have a miter box, you just have a saw. That's fine. I have my mark right here. I'm going to transfer it up. And then I'm going to line this piece up, the long point at that mark, and I can make this line, and that is what I want to cut. Now, this might be a tricky cut if you've never used the saw before, or not much anyways. Starting this, you'll probably wander all over the place. So one thing that could help is if you take your piece that's in decent shape, you can line it up to that line. Just make sure that the trim is even all the way so that that angle is correct. And then hold it right at that line. And you want to just hold those pieces together as tight as you can, and this will act as a guide for the saw. Just make sure the saw is straight up and down, it's not tilted, and just go nice and slow, let the saw do the work, and make this cut. And then you should have something that looks like that. Not bad. One disadvantage of cutting this with a handsaw is that it's hard to make really small cuts if you cut this too long. It's very common to cut something too long. It's better longer than to cut it shorter because you can always cut it again. With a miter saw like this or a chop saw, you can just line your piece up and then just take a little bit more off like this. But with a handsaw, that's a little more difficult. If you do end up cutting it long, you could try lining this back up the same way you just did. If you had to take off that amount, and then you can make that cut. Because as you can imagine, making a cut like that with this guide compared to just making it like that, that's going to be nearly impossible. So if you cut it too long, you could try that. If you cut it too short, you might end up doing what I did and caulk in the bottom. Or you can get a new piece. Hey, it's up to you. Before we do anything with attaching this, we want to line it up and make sure that it's going to fit. That looks pretty good. Nice. All right, we can attach it. So now, if it was me, because I have the tools, I would use a pin nailer and a finish gun to nail this trim in. But you probably don't have those, so this is what I'm going to use. Some finish nails, some hand hammered in finish nails. This is 1.5 inches. This is a 2.5 inch. You could probably get away with just using 1.5 inches. I'm going to use this into the jamb and this into the wall. Now, because I have it, I am going to put some wood glue here on this 45. That is not a 100% necessary step, but I like to glue my miters. So you line this up, make sure the bottom's tight, and then get your 45. Good. I like to start on the jamb side. Looks good. Get one nail in like this and try and get it into that jamb. So I'm going to do a slight angle. I'm going to wait right there. I'm going to put a nail right here. You just don't want to hammer and hit this and mess up the trim. So I'm going as close as I can without doing that. So you can see these nails are out a little bit. And what you could use is a nail set. Again, you probably don't have one of those, but what you do have is the nails that you're nailing these in with. So you can use one of those. You might end up bending it a little bit, but you should be able to set the nails with a nail. You want it just past the surface. Kind of like that. Same thing with this one. This one might be a little trickier. Now I'm going to do that same thing all the way down. Probably space these nails out about every foot or so. As I nail this down, I'm just going to hold it even against here. Make sure it's the same space all the way down. And you can keep an eye on the other side. And you should, as you nail it in, be lined up with the caulking that you cut out of there. And everything should match up if you got the same exact trim. Make sure that's tight against the baseboard, as tight as possible. This reminds me, I got to do my transition strip here. This floor is moving around. I don't want to talk about it. We're doing trim. We're doing trim right now, Matt. At this point, if you were a professional painter, you might buy a tub of nail hole filler and mix it with plaster of Paris. At that point, that's like $20 worth of filler that you're just going to use a small amount. And you would use that to go in these nail holes. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use caulking. And look at this. This is a tube of caulking that does not require a caulking gun, which is great if you don't have one, which you might not. And I'm going to caulk in all of the seams where this meets the wall, where this meets the jamb. I'm going to touch this crack up here. I'm going to hit this 45 and the baseboard down below, and then I'm going to fill in all these nail holes. Make sure when you get caulking that it is paintable. Do not get silicone. You cannot paint silicone. Work that in there. Use my wet paper towel. And this, I'm just gonna just do a little dab or a little dot, and then just wipe it flat. I would say that that looks a lot better. Now all I have to do is paint it. And I have this paint laying around. I like to keep a gallon or whatever I used in my basement. If you don't have the paint, you can take that piece of trim that you took off to the store and have them match it up. I hope I explained everything in a DIY friendly way for the novice, and maybe the expert is still here watching. And if you are, I appreciate it. Let me know what I did wrong or what I did right. Thanks for watching. I hope this helps. I'll see you on the next one. I know, listen, I know. It's my fault. We should have invited you to the party, and I'm sorry. You want to change the subject? Let's tell everybody about Patreon and YouTube memberships and how they can join and get exclusive behind the scenes footage of all these videos. That'd be cool, huh? No pressure. Totally up to you.
Want to replace some trim?
Clean workspace is important. How about that for a dustpan? Yeah. Now we're ready to install our piece. Well, wow. Doesn't even look like I cut anything. You could probably put this back on a shelf and it would basically look brand new. But I'm not telling you what to do.